So at this point we have our content and we have our specs, which are provided in the assignment instructions. That's really right here. These are the specs that we need to meet, and these are just some basic specs that we would meet for a printed document. And we also have our content, and we also have an idea of what our layout should be. So let's move into Illustrator to start setting this up. So when I open Illustrator, I'll probably be given a launch screen that asks if I want to create something as a quick start. I would recommend you close out of that, especially if you have not actually opened your installation of Illustrator before, or if it's a new version. The first thing that I think you need to do, or recommend you do, pay attention to see how each of these sizes is in points instead of inches. So what we want to do is go ahead and take a look at the settings for Illustrator before we open a document, because there are some global settings that if we adjust them without a document open, they'll apply to every document that we create in Illustrator, and that'll save us some time as well. I do actually recommend that you take a look through this entire section of preferences and go through each one of these tabs, but I'm not going to do that right now. I'm just going to make sure that you know this is here. But the thing that we need to look at specifically in this case are the units. And we want to make sure that our general units here are not pixels in this case. That would be good for web. I'm going to make sure that just as a global standard when I'm using Illustrator, I'd like my units to start out in inches. As far as stroke and type, I'm going to leave those as points because those make sense to me in points. But as far as like page size and the space between objects, I think more in feet and inches. And I think if you were born and raised in the US, most likely you think in feet and inches. Other cultures, other geographies, you might think more in the metric system. So choose one that makes the most sense for you. But for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to be discussing those types of measurements in feet and inches. Another thing you want to pay attention to is this is where you can come to set up a custom grid. So there's a default grid that places grid lines where we need them to be, but we can also change that, and we can change the color of some of those assistive items like grid lines and snaps and guides and things like that right here. Again, we have smart guides here where we can change the color that those show up in. We'll talk about those in a little bit. And then another thing I want to call your attention to is the user interface. And this is because I've had some students come to me with their own computers for help, and I noticed that they were having to squint at the screen when they were looking at the software. And so being aware that you can come in here and that you can adjust that so that it's easier for you to be able to see and it makes you more productive is really just valuable information to have. Notice you have 4 different levels of brightness for the user interface, and you also have the ability to scale the UI from small all the way up to large. And there's at least a medium benchmark in between, depending on the size screen you're on. Since I'm on a laptop, it looks like I can only choose between small and large. But if I was on a larger screen, there would be steps in between that I could also choose. So the main thing I want to bring you here for, though, is just to make sure that you change the units for the general measurements to inches. And then that way everything won't show up in points and you won't have to adjust that on a case-by-case basis. Now, once we move into this, I have to restart Illustrator because I changed the UI scaling. So I'm going to let it restart. And I'm still being given points here, which seems to be a more recent thing going on in Illustrator and InDesign. It used to be when you would change those that you would see feet and inches for everything after that. But for whatever reason, they don't change it here. It's still a good idea to do, though, because sometimes once you get into resizing something in the software itself, those points will show up in places that make it confusing for you. So the next thing I'm going to do is choose to create a new file, and I'm going to move to print. And we see I'm still being given points here for these, but I can change that unit right here on the start screen from points to inches. And now I can choose an 11 by 17 artboard. Right now it's 8.5 by 11. So what I'm going to do is manually change that to 11 by 17. I only need one artboard right now, but I do think it's valuable to see that you can create more than one. And notice it gives us bleed here. So I need an 1/8 of an inch bleed. If I click this up button once, and this is connected by a chain link, they're all top, bottom, left, and right going to change in proportion. And the first stop is an 1/8 of an inch. That's 0.125. If, however, you're having to type these things in and math is not a strong suit for you as far as, just dividing up whatever fraction you need, you can actually put in 1/8 inch and Adobe softwares will convert that for you. So keep that in mind as well. If we scroll down, I can see my color mode right now is CMYK, which is what I need for print. I can see that my raster effects are set at high, which is 300 ppi, which stands for pixels per inch, but that will translate in print to 300 dpi, which is dots per inch. Default preview mode is fine. If I click more settings, what I'm really looking for is to be able to set up the safety area by using page margins, but you notice Illustrator doesn't really provide that for me. InDesign does, so we'll see that a little bit later. But what I can do is go ahead and name my file so that I can get that out of the way and I don't forget. So I'm going to name my file using the nomenclature from the syllabus, which means I need to name it with the course prefix and number, and then whatever your section is. I'm going to put in a random section number here of, we'll put in B400. We don't actually have a B400, so make sure to put in your own section number for that. And then my first initial, my last name, and then this is project 1, exercise 1 for the class. So I'm going to type in a capital P and a 1, and then a lowercase e and a 1 for project 1, exercise 1. Now, this nomenclature is really important for how we name our files, but when we're posting to things like discussion forums and we're giving a title to that post, we can still use text that reads well to humans. So in other words, what we would call sentence case or title case. Once I do that and I create my document, we can see that I get a page that's starting to look like that diagram that I have to follow. So when I come back and take a look at that, I see I have my black line now for my paper. That's the 11 by 17. And then I also have my red line for my bleed. But what I'm missing is my safety area. So that's the next thing I want to set up. And I can do that one of two ways. I'm going to show you both ways to do that, and then you can choose between the two which makes the most sense for you. So another thing I want to call your attention to is if I have a lot of tools up here that you don't have, it's not that the software has changed, and it's not that you have a different release. It's generally just that I'm using a different workspace. And so a workspace in Adobe software is a collection of tools that open automatically depending on the task you're trying to complete. And if you come up here to this little icon that looks kind of like a desktop interface, this is my workspace button. And when I click switch workspace, if you have just opened Illustrator, you're probably in what's called the Essentials workspace. And that's right here. You can see there's no tools in this ribbon across the top. There are fewer windows open. You do have the properties panel, which is very helpful, and layers, but that's pretty much it. So if you're following along with me, or if you're completing a tutorial from another source and they seem to have a lot more tools at their disposal, just pause the video and try to match whichever workspace they're using, and that'll help save you some time. So in my case, I tend to work in the typography workspace the most because it has all the tools that I need. But I also want to point out to you, you can actually create your own workspaces as well. So if you end up in a workflow where you use the same tools and none of the custom or none of the default workspaces work for you, you can create one that automatically switches to those tools as you need them as well. For now, I'm going to switch back to typography because it gives me most of what I need across the top, and I'm used to working in that. And then I'm going to set up my safety area by using some guides, since Illustrator doesn't allow me to program that in with the document settings. One of the things I'm going to do is use my rulers to drop some guides. If you don't see your rulers, you can find them in the View menu. And let's see. Right here in Rulers, Show and Hide. But I also recommend, as you're learning to use these softwares, that you pay attention when there is a keystroke combination put next to the name of the tool, because if you use the tools a lot, it saves a lot of time just to learn the keystrokes instead of to be looking through these drop-down menus all the time. So one of the first strokes that you want to learn is going to be to show and hide your rulers. On a Mac, that's Command R. So on a PC, it would be Control R. And that toggles them on and off. So you can see that same keystroke command is going to turn them on or off for me. And then I can drop some guides here. Now, if I just click and hold and then drag out onto the artboard, this is going to drop what's called a guide. It's going to put down a guide for me that's not going to print, but it'll help me to be able to get my bearings and determine where my layout needs to be. So I can drop this down and I can use the ruler up here. You can see that it's going in 2, 4 from a 0. So this would be 1 inch, and then these dividers here would each be a 1/4 inch. So right around here is a 1/4 inch, but it's kind of hard to get it precise. So I could drop it in. Now I could zoom in really close and try to get this just on my own, spacing, but it's a lot easier to use just some basic programming to take care of this. So what I can do instead is come to my view menu and come down to my guides, and they are usually locked by default. So I can see here that I can choose to unlock guides. I'm going to unlock this because now I can select it. If it's locked, I can't select it and I can't do anything to it. But if I unlock it, I can position it how I want it to be. So I'm going to unlock it. And then I'm going to move back to this properties panel, and I can use my X and Y coordinates for my guides to make sure they're exactly where I want them to be. I can see that the top left corner of my page starts at 0 on both my X and Y axis. And what I need to do is just make sure that this is sitting a 1/4 inch off of the X axis. So I can see right now that my X is close. It's at 0.2475 and a 1/4 inch is 0.25. So I'm just going to update that to 0.25. And now I know that my guide is at exactly a 1/4 inch, and I didn't have to zoom in or work really hard or start over again, which I imagine you probably have done before if you haven't learned how to unlock the guides and move them and manipulate them like this. And now I can do the same thing by just dropping another guide, and this time I don't even really have to worry about how close I'm getting. I could just drop it somewhere on the page. It's going to be selected by default as long as my guides are unlocked, and then I can come back to my properties panel, and I can choose now to take a look at my X coordinate again, and I can see that it's at 9.9 and some change inches. Well, I know that this page is 11 inches wide, and I need my guide to be a 1/4 inch inside that page. So I just need to subtract a 1/4 inch from 11 inches. That's going to be 10.75. So I'm going to type in 10.75 into my X coordinate. And then you see that my guide moves in proportion right where it needs to be. So I'm going to do that again with my Y values, so my top and bottom guides. I can drag down pretty close, but then with that guide selected, I can check my Y coordinate, and I just need to change it for the top of the page to be 0.25. Let's see. And then I can scroll to the bottom of the page, and I can also get kind of close, but I don't need to worry about it. I know this is a 17-inch tall piece of paper, and so this needs to be 16.75. And now my guides are in place, and I can come back now so I don't forget, because see, now if I select things with them unlocked, they will move around if I'm selecting things on the page. So what I should do is come back to my view menu, come back to my guides, and lock my guides. And now when I'm selecting things on the page, those guides won't get selected and they'll stay put. So that is the first way that I can put guides on the page. Now, if that felt like a lot of math and that felt kind of confusing to you, you might decide that it would just be easier for you to create a box that is, a 1/4 inch smaller on all 4 sides than the page, and either incorporate that into your design or put it on a layer that doesn't print and that you can use as a guide. So I'm going to show you how to do that too. The first thing I can do is come here and choose my rectangle tool over in my toolbar here. And with it selected, I'm going to double click somewhere on what is called the artboard. The artboard is the paper, basically, that I'm designing. And then out here, this gray area is called the paste board. I can click in either one of those, but I'm going to double click. And then that allows me to create a rectangle of a specific size without having to, click and hold and drag and try to get it to the size I want it to be. So what I'm going to do is make this one a 1/2 inch smaller than 11 inches wide. And that's because I need a 1/4 on either side. And 1/4 plus 1/4 is a 1/2. And 11 inches minus 1/2 inch is 10.5, right? Same thing on the y-axis. It's a 17-inch piece of paper. Minus a 1/2 inch is going to be 16.5. Now when I create that, it's just going to put this box down somewhere kind of arbitrarily on the page. And yes, I could click and hold, and I could use smart guides, and I could try to get it close, but I could save myself a lot of time if I use the alignment tools to put this on the page. So before I do that, I'm going to give it a stroke down here. So we see these little boxes here. This is for fill color, so the inside of the shape, or the stroke, which is Adobe speak for the outline of the page. And I'm going to give this a color that's really obvious. Now I've got my little color slider right here, and I've also got my swatch panel, and it's got all of my default CMYK swatches in it. I'm going to use that, and I'm just going to pick red. Or actually, you know what, since our diagram used blue, how about if I go ahead and just use a blue color? And then I'm going to go to my stroke, which is the line, and I'm going to increase the weight of it and change it to a dashed line so it's easier to see. So what I'm going to do for that is, if you don't see it open here, you always want to come to the window panel. You see up here I've got some options for the stroke. Since this is selected and it has an outline, this is dynamic. It changes based on the thing that you've selected. But I could come to my window panel and I could open my stroke panel. And then I get all the options that are available there too. So in this case, I'm going to take its weight up to more like 3 points so it's thicker and I can see it. And then I'm going to change it to a dashed line as well. By default, it's just going to put this 12-point dash in kind of a default gap there. You could actually have custom dashes though if you want to change the space in between them and the length of the dashes. We're not going to do that right now though. And for now, I'm going to use my alignment tools here, which again are in my quick choices up here in my typography menu, but I can also come to my window and I can open up my alignment panel. You may as well, because we're going to use it a lot for this. And what I'm going to do is make sure that I am aligning to the artboard. That means this, you know, the paper, the white piece of paper. And I'm just going to, with this box selected, choose to align horizontally to the center and align vertically to the center. And you see how it snaps right into place, and I didn't really have to do a lot of clicking and dragging. Now, it took me longer to do it because I'm explaining it all, but once you understand how to do it, it'll be second nature and you'll be able to be really quick with it. The last thing that I want to do is, if I zoom in and look at this really closely, I can see that I have set up a safety area, but by default, the outline of the shape is centered on the outer border of the shape. And so if I actually did align something to the edge of this, then I would be outside of my safety area, and that would be a problem. So what I can do next is select my border that I've created here. And in my stroke panel, to come back and find my stroke panel. But it's around here somewhere. It's also probably in the properties panel. Let's come back to our window and go find our stroke panel. Looks like it did close. And I can choose to align the stroke instead of to the center by default. I can choose to align it to the inside of the shape, and then it's going to show up a little bit better. So let me try to get that selected. I think it's selecting my guides for some reason right now. Let me make sure those are locked. I know they were, but I hit undo at a point. Yeah, they are. Okay. Let's see. It doesn't seem to want to do it for whatever reason. Maybe it's because it's dashed. Yeah, look, when it's not dashed, I can do it. I can align it to the inside. Let's see what happens if I try to dash it now. Yeah, that works. Okay. After I've done that, the only other thing that I want to do to get set up for this is to make sure that, first off, this doesn't print so that I don't forget and print it by mistake. And the best way to do that is actually just to put it on a layer of its own and set that layer not to print. So what I'm going to do next is go to my layers panel. And right now I'm working on a default layer that was created when I opened up the document called Layer 1. I have to have at least one layer. If I double click not on the name of the layer, but off to the side of it right here, it'll open up my layer options. And here I can rename it. So I'm going to name this Guides. And then I'm going to uncheck Print right here. And I can also go ahead while I'm in here and check Lock. And this is where, if I wanted to have different colors for the things associated with this layer, the bounding boxes and things like that, I have a lot of different choices that I could use. I'm going to stick with light blue for now and just click OK. And you see now it's the name of the layer is in italics. That means it's not going to print. And I can turn it on and off. And we see now that I lose both of my guidelines and the container that I set up for this. So what I need to do now is create another layer that I can continue to work on. I'm going to create a new layer down here. I'm going to drag this layer beneath my guides layer, and I'm going to name this one Background. And what I need to put on here is the background. So when I create that full bleed, which is a requirement of the assignment, again, I need to choose some sort of color that extends past the size of the page so that if there's some wobble when it's getting cut down to size or printed, the color still goes all the way to the edge. So to do that, I just need to create yet another rectangle on my background layer this time. and it has to go at least to the red line here. It can go further, but it has to go at least to the red line here. So I could zoom out and I could just click and drag, and you see how when I'm getting close to these things, how there's this highlight of this fuchsia color? That's what's called smart guides. You can turn them on or off, and they can be really useful, or they can honestly be a real hindrance depending on what you're working on. For this, they're useful. So I'm going to leave them on, and I'm going to let the smart guide snap me right to the corner of that. And then I'm going to pull down here and let the smart guides snap right to the edge of the bleed as well. And now I've created a shape here that currently still has that solid blue outline. So I don't want it to have an outline color, but I do want it to have a fill. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to come back to my swatches. And for now, I'm actually going to give it a neutral color because I know my next poster is focused on color. So I don't want this to be too colorful because then that's going to make it really hard for me to create a hierarchy in my color poster. So I'm just going to choose kind of a middle gray right now. And the most important part is that you can see that this goes past the black line that denotes the edge of the page. All right, so what I see here is my color goes all the way to the red line, and that's how I create a full bleed. So once I've done that, I'm pretty well set up. I do not want to change the settings for this background layer because I do want the color to print. But I do want to lock it. I can do that without opening up all the layer options. I can just lock it here. And then I'm going to create one last layer, and this layer is going to actually hold all of my content, all of my shapes, and all of my text. So I'm going to change the name of this one to content. I'm going to leave it unlocked, and in the next video, we'll start laying out the page.